In 1963, an insurance actuary sat down with the blueprints for a 630-foot stainless steel monument, one with no scaffolding, no safety nets, and men welding while hanging over open air 500 feet above the Mississippi River, and did the math on how many of them wouldn't make it home. His number was 13. Not 13 injuries, 13 deaths, calculated in advance, built into the insurance premiums before a single piece of steel left the mill in Pennsylvania. This is the Gateway Arch. You've stood under it, driven past it, seen it on 100 postcards of St. Louis. Most people assume it went up the way any big modern monument goes up. Cranes, hard hats, safety harnesses, a construction site like any other, just taller. But the truth is that the arch was built almost entirely without the safety equipment we'd consider mandatory today, by fewer than 100 men doing jobs that had never existed before and would never exist again, on a structure that had a real, documented chance of simply not meeting in the middle. By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly what it took, physically, mentally, and in raw nerve, to be one of the people who put that arch in the sky. These details come from National Park Service construction archives, the documentary Monument to the Dream, and first-hand interviews with the ironworkers themselves, some of whom didn't talk about it publicly until 50 years later. Number 5. The closure crew. Somebody had to close the gap. For 2.5 years, the two legs of the arch rose independently, each one a 300-foot cantilever leaning out over the Mississippi, with nothing holding it up but its own steel, and a temporary strut truss bolted in at the 500-foot mark. On October 28, 1965, it was time to join them, and the crew responsible for the final section had a margin of error of less than half a millimeter, about the thickness of a fingernail, to get a 10-ton piece of stainless steel to fit between two legs of a building that had been rising toward each other, unchecked, for over 2 years. But steel expands in the sun. On the morning of the closure, the south leg had heated up just enough to throw off the gap by several inches, enough to ruin 2 years of work in a single afternoon. Therefore, the St. Louis Fire Department was called in, not to fight a fire, but to hose the south leg down with cold river water for 45 minutes straight, shrinking the steel back down to size, while a hydraulic jack, essentially an oversized car jack, forced the legs apart just enough to slide the final wedge home. Steamboats on the Mississippi sounded their whistles the moment it dropped into place. That's the kind of pressure a construction job usually only sees in a disaster movie, except here, it was Tuesday. That's the story everybody who's heard of the arch has heard at least a piece of. What almost nobody knows is what the man standing on top of that final section could actually see while it happened, which is almost nothing at all. Number 4. The Weld X-ray Inspector. Clarence Cherry spent 2 years of his life working the arch at night, alone, with a Geiger counter clipped to his belt. His job was to inspect every weld holding the arch's stainless steel skin to its carbon steel skeleton, using a portable X-ray machine to look inside metal that would eventually carry the entire weight of a 630-foot structure. He worked after dark specifically because the process required radiation, and every other worker on site had to clear the area and stay clear, because standing near an active weld X-ray meant standing in a radiation field. Cherry himself had to retreat a safe distance and trigger the machine remotely, night after night, for 2 straight years, on a job site 400 feet in the air, with no guardrail between him and the Mississippi River below. Most people picture 1960s construction danger as a falling risk, a man losing his footing on a beam. But the arch had an invisible danger built directly into its quality control process, one that had nothing to do with height and everything to do with exposure. Most of the crew never even had to think about, because it was Cherry's job to absorb that risk so the rest of the structure could be trusted. He wasn't the only one working blind, in the dark 400 feet up, with someone else's life depending on what he could and couldn't see. Number 3. The phone man. When the final section was lowered into place, the crane operator running the whole operation was on the ground and could not see the top of the arch at all. The man responsible for guiding that crane blind was standing on the structure itself, over 300 feet in the air, relaying every inch of movement over a phone line in real time. Clarence Cherry held that job too, after a raising gang foreman simply told him one day, "You're the new phone man," and sent him up. He described building a mental picture for the crane operator with words alone, left, right, closer, hold, while thousands of people watched from the riverbanks below, because on the day of the final closure, it felt like the entire city of St. Louis had stopped to look up at once. There was no redundancy in that system, but there also wasn't a backup plan if the final piece came in even a few inches off. The tolerances were too tight, the crowd was too large, and the moment was too public to fail quietly. Therefore, the entire operation rested on one man's voice, describing a 10-ton object he could barely see himself, to an operator who couldn't see it at all. That's the kind of pressure that doesn't show up in any blueprint, and it was only possible because of what the raising gang below him had already survived to get that section built. Number 2. The raising gang. Before there was a phone man or a closure crew, there was the raising gang, the ironworkers who actually caught each 12-foot steel wedge as it came in on the crane, wrestled it into position, and welded it permanently to the section before it. Surviving footage from Monument to the Dream shows these men walking narrow scaffold boards hundreds of feet up with what one modern viewer called really not much safety protection. No harnesses clipped to anything, cigarettes lit while they worked, arms wrapped bodily around curved steel to hold themselves steady while they welded. One St. Louis ironworker who watched the footage decades later said it gave him the heebie-jeebies just to see other men bare hugging the steel over a 500-foot drop. The regulations that would make that kind of exposure illegal today simply didn't exist yet in 1963. OSHA itself wouldn't be created for another 7 years. But the workers who did the raising gang job weren't reckless. They were selected for it. Project management specifically picked crews that could hold their composure at extreme height, because the honest truth, according to the men who worked it, was that anyone who felt real fear up there didn't stay very long. Therefore, the job selected, over time, for a very specific kind of person, steady-handed, unflinching, comfortable being one slipped boot away from a fatal fall, week after week, for 2.5 years, and even that crew couldn't do their job without the machine that carried them there in the first place. Number 1. The creeper Derrick operator. Standard cranes could only lift steel to about 72 feet before the archer's design made them useless, because past that point there was nothing solid to plant a crane's base on. The solution was the creeper Derrick, a 100-ton machine, essentially a construction crane bolted directly onto the leg of the arch itself, that literally climbed the structure a level at a time as the legs grew taller. Its steel legs had to continuously adjust to hug the changing curvature of the arch, hoisting sections that weighed roughly 50 tons apiece into position, each one taking around 30 minutes of precise, high-stakes maneuvering, hundreds of feet above the ground, on a machine that was riding the very structure it was building. Nothing else like it had ever been built before, and the men who ran it were essentially operating a heavy industrial crane while standing on top of an unfinished cantilever that swayed in the wind. But it worked exactly as designed, for both legs, for 2.5 years straight, with no Derrick failure, no dropped section, and no structural miscalculation large enough to keep the two halves of the arch from meeting within 0.5 millimeter of dead center. Every job on this list existed because the creeper Derrick made it possible to keep building past the point where ordinary construction equipment simply gave up. Here's the number that ties every one of these jobs together. That actuary's prediction of 13 deaths wasn't a scare tactic. It was a professional risk calculation based on the tallest, most dangerous, most improvised construction project the country had attempted in decades, using fewer than 100 workers to do a job the city had originally promised would employ 5,000. And when the final section dropped into place on October 28, 1965, not one of those 13 predicted deaths had happened. Not one worker died building the gateway arch, not the raising gang bear-hugging steel with no harness, not Clarence Cherry absorbing radiation alone at night, not the phone man talking a blind crane operator through the most watched lift in St. Louis history. The arch isn't just a monument to westward expansion. It's a monument to 100 guys who did the actual math on their own mortality, went up anyway, and beat the odds an insurance company had already priced into the job. Next time you're standing under it, remember, the smoothest, most photographed structure in St. Louis was built by the least protected workforce imaginable, and every single one of them walked away.